over the years, because I primarily have been a publisher, a journalist. Sometimes I've ran consulting and training practices, but for the most part, not. But I think we've arrived at a lot of similar conclusions around projects, and I think we both don't mind being a little bit outspoken about what we've learned, particularly things like the dangers of customers being over dependent on mega SIs that don't have their best interests at heart, and vendors flogging technology that might really be, if not snake oil, not ready for prime time. Things like that. I think you and I have a lot in common in terms of our desire to have a more practical and perhaps more jugular conversation about what it takes to be successful in this industry. But anyway, that eventually found my way to Diginomica with some other cohorts about 8 years ago. And we were basically disillusioned with a lot of stuff around how enterprise publishing was done, how enterprise media worked, how the enterprise analyst game worked. And we wanted to try to sort of disrupt that, I guess, by creating our own thing. We've had some good success with that. And so we're now 8 years in. I will say it still feels like a startup a lot of the time. Some of that's good. Some of that keeps me up at night, but I can tell you a little bit more about what drives Diginomica, but that's sort of my main undertaking now.
Right. Yeah, and that's how a lot of my interaction exposure to your thought leadership has been through Diginomica, which you're co-founder of, and also Enterprise Irregulars. I think that's where I originally first started interacting with you or sort of following you as a thought leader in the space. So tell us a little bit about Diginomica for those that don't know, and maybe it will help for those that don't know how to spell it and how to find it. But it's Diginomica. So Diginomica.com. And just to preface it, for those that don't know, it's a really good, I would consider a very good agnostic and pragmatic source for enterprise technology transformation type stuff. I mean, it's very easy to follow. It's very unbiased. And like I said, very practical. You're not sort of up in the clouds like a lot of analysts are, speaking foreign languages that don't apply to everyday realities. But maybe tell us a little bit about Diginomica. Why'd you start it? What's the goal of what is it, first of all, and why'd you start it?
A couple different reasons. We started it because we felt that most tech industry publications are pretty crap and pretty not enterprise focused as well. And we felt there was a need to provide context to enterprise news. But one of the big things, like the user experience on all the big tech sites, is just so terrible. Autoplay videos, pop-ups everywhere, advertising game, chasing eyeballs, chasing viral stories. We wanted to build a business model that was centered more around providing real practical advice that enterprise customers and people that have a stake in the enterprise can use. And a big focus of Diginomica has been, from the beginning, but really became this notion of transformation in the enterprise. And we're advocates of transformation, but not in the way that vendors sell it. We're advocates of it in the sense that we think that there's a success to be had on the other side of the pursuit of transformation in a corporate context. But it's not just technology, it's culture, it's process, it's people, it's everything. And there's a lot of very good reasons for that. I think people are more and more receptive to that message, obviously. The last year and a half certainly helps in that regard, though it's obviously been a tragic circumstance, so it's not something we wanted to happen. But there is that sense in which, we do need to do business differently if we want to stay agile enough to compete. And so we really look at that from a large enterprise perspective primarily, and that's sort of driven our publication since we started.
Right. Yeah. And you guys just put out, massive amounts of content. You cover so many different nooks and crannies of the enterprise space. I'm always fascinated by how much you guys, it's not just SAP or Oracle or Microsoft. You're covering the whole spectrum of all types of technologies and implementation, best practices and lessons, and just I read it a lot of times just to keep up to date on what's going on, who bought, what vendor acquired what software, and what's going on with some of the vendors. You guys are really good at covering more of the newsworthy type stuff too, in addition to the more opinionated type stuff.
Yeah. And, part of our goal is that there's so much noise around stuff. And so we want people to be like, well, if I read just one article to really understand what this news means, then maybe it would be an article from us, or we can try to provide some context to that. And that's always the goal. Look, we don't always succeed. I mean, not every article that we publish is brilliant, but we do try to focus on people who are very experienced and understand the enterprise and aren't afraid to take a position. Most of our articles, aside from customer stories, which we do quite a bit of as well, most of our articles have a take where the writer takes a position at the end of the article on what they're seeing. And we think that's important to put a stake in as far as what does this mean and what do I think this is a good or bad move and why. We don't pretend to be above the fray. If you look at our site, our partners include a number of vendors, and some of them we cover their information. We're rigorous about disclosure. We think that transparency and how you're funded is a really, really big part of things. And so that's a key. Every one of our blog posts has relevant disclosures in it when we do have any vendors that are involved that we do business with. And so, we don't pretend to be like better than the business. I mean, everyone in this business is getting paid by someone, but we do try to rise above that. And also, have strong words even for those that we do business with. And one thing we tell vendors we work with is that we're still going to criticize you and we're still going to raise points and issues that we think you need to think about, because, the other thing that is just really important, and this is something that I think Diginomica as a group believes this too, but this is something I believe very strongly, is that not enough enterprise projects get across the finish line in a way that we could call successful. I mean, you've been an expert witness in a lot of situations, so you know how wrong these products can go when they really go wrong. But I find most projects are actually fairly mediocre and don't achieve a lot of the promised benefits. And I think everyone in this industry has a collective responsibility to change that. And so that is a driving focus. But I also think that humor is important too. So if you want to get a flavor for that, I would recommend starting with my weekly Enterprise Hits and Misses column, which is really me at my most unbridled. That comes out every Monday morning. And that's me taking snarky shots at things, but also trying to put the week's enterprise news in context.
Yeah, every time I see that you've tagged me in one of those, and I know you've covered something I've written, I have a moment of flattery, but then I have a moment of fear of like, what's he going to say though? It might be positive. He might be saying he agrees with me, but there's times where you've put stuff out and you're like, hey, yeah, here's an interesting tape. Totally disagree. Here's what I think, which I appreciate. I like how you're not afraid to sort of either build on a topic or challenge it or, provide a different perspective. And that's why I enjoy reading your stuff. And for those on the live stream here, if you haven't checked out Diginomica, it really is a good source. I mean, it's like I said, newsworthy, very good opinions. And every article I read from you, there's at least 2 to 3 times throughout the read that I will laugh out loud at some of the stuff you say, because some of it is just so honest that it's funny in a way. It's like, I can't believe he's actually saying that. It's absolutely true, but I can't believe he's saying it. Or it's just flat out humor that you're using. So you have a very unique writing style that I enjoy. So I think others here on the live stream would probably appreciate it too. So you cover a lot of stuff. You see a lot of, like I said, a lot of vendors, a lot of trends in the market. What are, if you just step back and look at all the stuff you're covering right now, what gets you most excited about the space right now? Is there anything that just kind of pops out at you as like, hey, this is a really big deal, or maybe a hidden gem of a trend or something that's happening out there that the rest of us aren't really paying attention to? Or what are some of those things that excite you that's happening out there?
Well, I'm excited by 2 things. One is kind of classic and one is kind of like more new stuff. I mean, the thing that excites me in a classic sense is conversations like we're having today, where we can be very informal and like honest about what's really happening in the enterprise. And I never get tired of that. Like whether it's a dinner at a trade show or if you get lucky enough to go to an online event where there actually is a forum for that. I think like people putting heads together and like genuinely sharing their experiences and trying to solve problems, like to me that never gets old. But as far as like trends are concerned, I'm a little grouchy with a lot of trend stuff, because like when you've been around for a long time, you see like I always want to know, how is this thing different than the last thing? So in other words, like digital transformation, one of my first questions on that was like, I challenge anyone who used that phrase to tell me why it's different than change management, because we're using that phrase. Now we're using this new phrase. So why is that different? Same thing with AI ops, for example. Okay, that sounds cool, new and different. Well, how is that different than just workflow automation, for example? So all of that stuff really bothers me. And so I'm not like a futurist, which is kind of what you and I were talking about before, is like, I don't like to get tagged by that label because I get really irritated by For example, so many people got burned by blockchain and spent so much money on blockchain that I don't think they're ever going to see ROI on. Not that it won't eventually mature and have use cases, but it's just one thing. I don't like fanning the hype of stuff. But having said that, I do like what modern enterprise technology is shaping up as, because I do think the technology is getting better. And I think that reinforces some very interesting things. Like, for example, this year, I've done a couple of stories where you call it low code ERP if you want. Low code doesn't really matter that much as a buzzword, but the idea is basically putting power in the hands of business users to basically automate their own workflows and do stuff without having to go through IT. And the same thing goes with things like reporting and analytics, where there used to be all these IT bottlenecks around all of this type of stuff. And these days you simply can't afford to wait till the end of the month or the year to get certain kinds of reports or data, or to build like a new little app or something. And the more I see business users being able to take that power in their own hands, the more excited I get about where enterprise software could ultimately wind up as, because so far it really hasn't gotten there as much as the marketing folks would have you believe. But that's what kind of gets me excited, is seeing business users truly engaged.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And use word taking the power back, almost, taking the power back from IT, and also taking the power back from consultants or system integrators. I mean, because a lot of times these companies, they get so dependent on the big SIs or outside consultants that they can't function without them, because they just have this black hole of lack of knowledge that the SI or the consultants have. But now we're kind of shifting that to make it to where you don't necessarily need that level of outside support.
I totally agree. And in case people think I'm kind of like criticizing IT and kind of and casting a negative light on IT, I'm not at all. In fact, I think I just did a use case about a CIO who looks like he's really going to be able to deliver for the business in the medical industry with their vision of more connected care for patients, which is a really good thing for everyone. And this CIO is getting much more engaged with business outcomes because he feels he has the technology to deliver on that. And like, to me, I actually get depressed when I run into companies that don't have any IT. Now, granted, there are some startups that have a cloud first thing and they got to move fast. They don't want to build IT. But in general, I like IT as a differentiator. I like the idea of people in IT working on differentiated projects, embedding their technology into smart devices, or building customer-facing apps, or doing really cool stuff that impacts their business. I love that vision of IT. I just don't like the vision of IT as like, and of course, security and compliance, all that stuff matters also. But I just don't like that vision of IT as like the bottleneck that prevents business users from getting things done.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And it also, forces the business users to connect the dots between the technological needs and what those business needs are.
Totally.
And they're best equipped to do that, for sure. What about, and by the way, before I ask you this next question, please feel free to pop in any questions that the audience has here too. Ultimately, that's what we want to get to, are your questions. And again, it's really the good news with having you on the show. There's no one topic that we need to focus on. You're kind of that broad view of the marketplace here. So anything that's vendor specific or trend specific, implementation best practices.
Take a crack at it. Between you and me, to be able to come up with something. So
yeah, well, if we can't, then we probably shouldn't be doing what we're doing. If we can't come up with some sort of answer. So please do submit your questions here. But what about maybe let me go the opposite direction of what I just asked you, and talk about what are those trends or buzzwords that you think right now are the most overhyped, or that an enterprise technology buyer should be the most leery of? I know you mentioned blockchain a little bit, but what are some of your thoughts there?
Well, I mean, a lot of these buzzwords do represent topics that are worth reckoning with. It's just you have to be wary about immediately opening up your wallet and feeling like you can't be successful without it. One that gets a lot of debate right now is customer data platforms. That's huge on the CX side. And so the question then becomes like, is this new and different than the data integration activities we've undertaken in the past? And so you need to really take a hard look at that. And will we get a better result? Like, integrating all your customer data sounds wonderful, but then think about, well, what about our finance data, and what about the rest of our corporate data that we may need visibility into, our supply chain data. How can you serve customers if you don't have visibility into your supply chain? So these acronyms like CDP, you have to be really, really careful when vendors start glomming onto that, because they're doing it partially because they're going to sell a bunch of stuff to you. I think we have to be really careful with AI. There's all kinds of problems with AI. A lot of AI tools ship in problematic ways that perhaps include biases. We see that a ton in HR. You do a search on AI recruitment controversy, and you'll find all kinds of stuff around companies that tried AI tools for recruiting and found that they were actually screening qualified applicants or not including diverse applicants for various reasons. So there's always an underbelly to these technologies. It doesn't mean that they're bad. It just means they deserve a close look. So I don't know that I would say any of them. I mean, blockchain's a little bit of a special case because it was so hyped when there were just no use cases. And I'm still waiting to do my first live production scale enterprise blockchain story. I keep telling vendors, like, please send me your live production story. Nope. But we've got this great POC, which is proof of concept. We've been doing POCs in blockchain now for 5 or 6 years. And so that, that's obviously technology that I get a little particularly wary of, just because, the use cases aren't there yet.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good way to look at it. I think I agree with you, by the way. I think there's so many cool technologies out there, and blockchain is one of them, but you have to take it all with a grain of salt and recognize that even if you do commit to a certain technology, whether it's a type of technology or even a certain vendor or a certain specific software solution, there's always an underbelly to it, like you said. And I think that's true for any solution out there, for sure. We're getting a few comments or questions here from the audience, so maybe I'll jump in here. First is a comment that it's worth noting here, and you alluded to this a minute ago, Jon, but Greg mentions here that Jon owns Cloud ERP Friday afternoons here on LinkedIn. So it's a little plug for you have a show that you do on.
Yeah. It's usually at 4 Eastern, though. I'm probably not going to do it today because I wanted to focus on this show. So, but yeah, usually Fridays at 4:30 have kind of a blowout. It's not always about Cloud ERP, though. I do a fair amount of CX stuff. Mostly I just interview independent thinkers in the enterprise and see where the conversations go. It's not unlike this format. So
very cool. Okay. Well, yeah, we'll be sure to check that out for the audience there. Another comment that I've dropped a few comments on Diginomica over the years, all taken in good stride. So another fan of your publication there, or your outlet there. Here's a question: What are the API integration best practices for before, during, or after implementation, provided that the client has quite a few best of breed systems? So that's a very specific question. We're jumping right in here, going straight into the weeds. The API integration. I don't know if that's
it's actually really. I'm glad you raised that. And what's one interesting thing, just by the way, is I was going to say another buzzword I'm very wary of is multi-cloud, and I was just discussing this the other day, and how I like the idea of multi-cloud environments, but the problem becomes that that the tools to allow customers to easily move workloads between clouds just haven't delivered on the multi-cloud promise. So that's one I would advise being very wary of as a term. But the idea of like avoiding lock-in is always a really good discussion to have. As far as APIs are concerned, I mean, the thing about APIs is that they are a step forward from classic point-to-point integration, but you do need to be conversing with the vendors that are responsible for providing those APIs and understanding what the impact of it is, and also your technology team. Not all APIs are created equal. Some of them are more robust and have more business content and are more readily usable. Others will get you into trouble if you don't have certain standard configurations. And I know you cover this a lot in your blog, but if you get over customized, and you can do this even with cloud software, sometimes it can affect those API integrations going forward. One of the biggest things you need to ask about with the vendors around APIs is, what is the testing going to look like with these APIs going forward? Could they break? If so, how? And because an API works today doesn't mean it's going to work 3 months from now when a number of vendors have updated their software, or a year from now, likewise. So I think the biggest thing about APIs is to realize that they're not some magic solution. And in fact, like, I believe that if certain vendors work very closely together on a lot of projects, that they need to go beyond APIs and provide a deeper level of sophisticated integration. One good example of that would be Salesforce, just because they are a partner of ours. So take it for what that's worth. But so many customers want to integrate whatever they're doing with Salesforce, especially like in the ERP space or whatever. So I think it's very important to ask about what kind of dedicated integration you have and what the relationships are between those vendors. Do those vendors talk to each other at all around their API strategies and their integration strategies? So, I mean, I've never been on an API project, so you have to take that with a grain of salt, but those are the kinds of questions I'd be asking. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true. And especially in today's day and age, where I think that whole best of breed concept is becoming more acceptable and more common. 10, 20 years ago, it was almost a bad word to say, I'm going to have 2 or 3 or 4 different systems and tie them all together. But now the tools are generally flexible enough and the architectures are open enough that you can do that more realistically. But, you still have to make sure it's all going to work together and that you've clearly defined your data strategy and you understand where the data is going to reside and how you're going to manage that master data, where you're going to manage it. So there's just a lot of variables that need to be addressed, but not to say you shouldn't do it. It's just back to the point of the underbelly or the risks. You've got to be able to manage those pieces.
Beware of seamless integration, folks.
Yes.
Seamless integration. That is one of the phrases that always scares me.
Yeah. And I had a call with a client this morning, actually, who is a customer of SAP S/4HANA, a space that I know very well as well. And we both have histories with being in the SAP world earlier in our careers. But he had talked about how with SAP, it's actually easier, in his opinion, it's easier to integrate non-SAP products than it is to integrate SAP's own products to each other, which I thought was super interesting comment.
Ouch.
Yeah. So I thought, well, that's because you would assume, if I'm buying a bunch of stuff from one vendor, it's going to seamlessly integrate, right? I mean, it makes sense. You would think, but then you get into the reality of it and it doesn't quite work that way.
Well, right. We could have a discussion about acquired products and how that changes that, but
yes, with the Reba and Concur and all the acquisitions they've done in particular.
So, Eric, I wanted to mention to you, you're kind of guiding our question flow, so you can decide where you want to take this. But I did prepare some unique content for your audience in your show. What I did,
yes.
You write a lot about project success and how to achieve it. So what I did is I came up with my underrated keys to project success that I believe don't get enough airtime. And I thought you might enjoy hearing them because it might clash with some of yours and be kind of fun. So I prepared, I think, about 8 of them. I don't have an exact count because some of them are kind of related to each other. But anyway.
Yeah,
I got them. Great. So whenever you want to hit them, I've got them for you.
Let's jump into it because I think that'll stimulate, and I'm excited too because I have no idea what's on your list, which is great.
You do not.
And I want to hear what the audience has to say too. So I'll kind of watch. I think it'll probably stimulate more questions and comments. So yeah, please fire away. Your top 8 or 10 or however many it is, cool. Underrated keys to success.
Yeah. Well, let me preface this by just quickly saying that a lot of the keys to project success you read about on Eric's blog, for example, are pretty, I don't want to say they're mundane, but they're not sexy, but they just are true. Things like executive buy-in, change management is a theme that you hit all the time. That's obviously a given. Training, for example, companies continue to chronically underinvest in training. And when you look at why products fall short, it's often like a real key to why they did. And so there are things like that that are there that I'm not going to mention today just because they're obvious. They're important though, but they're just not that much fun to talk about because we keep talking about them.
Right.
But then there's some newer ones that are kind of important that I'm not going to get into as well, but they have to do with the fact that a lot of these multi-year products now, you could have a multi-year transformation project, but I don't believe you're going to see it through unless you have so-called quick wins. So one of the big jobs of today's products is figuring out what those quicker wins are going to look like. That has to be put into place as part of this. But the quick wins have to tie into an overall platform strategy. So in other words, the other mistake companies have made, and this I've seen it in the pandemic as well, is roll out an app quickly to customers because you need to have a direct to customer app, but you didn't think about what happens when I build 10 more apps, and I have 10 of them. They need to be really on the same platform and be sharing the same design characteristics probably. But did you think through that? And with data platforms, it's the same, because more and more this is about information and data and not just transactional systems. So you have to have a data platform strategy as well. But I think a lot of that is all understood. I'm not going to sit here and say it's easy. I think that's understood. The other one I think that's understood is that you have to be able to know how you're going to measure your success. And so I think more and more attention is being paid, and rightly so, to what are the metrics by which we judge these outcomes. And the metrics need to be much more business oriented than they were in the past. So not just, we got off of these legacy systems and now we're processing more transaction per second. Who cares? Are you getting closer to your customer? Are you getting closer to your suppliers? All that kind of stuff. So that's all sort of the understood stuff. So let me get to the stuff that I think is more underrated stuff.
Sure.
I believe a lot of this comes down to what I call the paradox of customer ownership, which is that successful projects require more customer ownership over the outcome of those projects and less what I would call sort of trust in the SI. I was going to say blind faith, but that's not entirely fair. But less trust in the SI. A lot of times the external partners get in there because they've been in there for a long time and they've built the relationships up, and it's kind of a given. And I kind of reject that. I think you need to step back from that a little bit. Software selection is rarely the reason a project goes wrong, but you do have to choose the right software.
Yeah.
But the thing I would say, the first underrated key is picking the right partner, and that has an industry component to me. So you need someone who understands your industry, and that's why the generic SI thing I'm skeptical of, because a lot of times I think the best SI or partner for your project may not be a large SI. Maybe it is, but it's got to be people that understand your industry and can speak to you about what other customers in your industry are doing, how they're winning, where they're going wrong. If they can't have that conversation with you, I don't care how well they know your software, they won't be able to help you. These generic software categories like ERP and CRM, they are not going to be generic categories in 5 years. I can tell you, even in the CRM world, they're talking about industry now, and how do we create customer management, customer experience applications that fit a particular industry situation. So you need partners that understand your industry. So that's my top key.
Right. It's a good one.
Do you want to comment on that before I move into a few others, or?
No, I think it's a great point. I mean, I think too many companies get enamored by a name. It's Accenture, it's Deloitte, it's IBM, whoever. And the saying that drives me crazy is no one ever got fired for hiring IBM or Accenture or Deloitte, except I can name a ton of people that have been fired for hiring one of them. That's the caveat to that.
Or and wound up in court, like in various lawsuits that you've served as an expert witness on as well. And look, there are some great teams and larger SIs as well. So I'm not just going to sit here and trash that. It's more, but I think you have to look more at experience than name, and make sure that those you engage with are the ones who are actually going to be seeing your project through and on the ground with you, quote unquote, even if they're not on the ground per se. They may not be on the ground, but you know what I mean. My next one.
No matter who it is, even if it's a great fit, whether it's a big SI or not, you still have to manage those consultants. I mean, it's your project and you still have to own it. So I think that's the other thing too, is don't assume that just because you found the right one, that now your work here is done, they're going to take it from here. You still have to work very closely with them and collaborate and have the right controls in place and all that stuff. So
my next one is I look for signs of struggle in the customer partner relationship. And by that, I mean, I want to, when I do interviews and such, I want to hear about the hard times. I don't care what project you have. If you didn't have a hard time in a moment of truth or two on that project, I don't buy your success. And I'm looking for partners that are not perfect and have these perfect rosy stories. I'm looking for stories of how we had a gut punch and how we came together and overcame it. That's what I want to hear about. And I don't hear enough of those stories, but that's what I look for. And when I see really successful projects, that's what I see. Is I see a relationship between the customer, the vendor, the partner that have all been tested and they've seen it through. And that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, that's a great one. And it gets back to the point of every decision, whether it's a which consulting partner, which vendor, or which product you use, or whatever it may be, there's always a dark side to it, or there's always some sort of risk or some sort of not a failure point, but mistake, like in the case of consultants, where have they made mistakes, where have the challenge has been with the project. And if you're not picking up on that, then you're missing something, because it's there. You just have to understand what they are.
Bingo. And a lot of the rest of mine kind of fall into a general category, which is that I have a lot more confidence and hear a lot more good things with customers that the way I put it is they come up for air more often. So in other words, they're not heads down all the time, focused on themselves. They have context. They have context to what their peers are doing. They have context to what the industry are doing. They enjoy debating trends with analysts and bloggers and people like yourself. So there are different components to that. I look for example, it's a cultural thing, right? In the sense that there are some companies that really don't encourage or provide budget for their employees to do these things. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think a lot of them are ultimately self-defeating. Some of the reasons are, oh my gosh, like if we give our employees all these networking and immersion opportunities and send them to conferences and stuff, they'll meet other employers and they'll get hired away from us. And so like, let's be insular, but it always fails in the end. And so I look for things like active user group involvement. I look for people who are always out there networking on LinkedIn and elsewhere, asking questions in product forums, getting information. That kind of stuff is so invaluable. When I see customers talking together at trade shows and swapping war stories, I sit here and say, gosh, every minute of this is worth thousands of dollars of consulting time. What they're bringing home to their team from these conversations gives them such huge perspective. So many of the problems that we run into on projects are because we're not getting regular infusions of good information that make us all more, understanding of what is really happening and how to get a good result. So a lot of things fall into that category. And I'll add another one to it, but I'll see if you have a comment on that.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I mean, as a consultant, and it's easy to think that, people are just going to want to come to you to get the answers and get the advice. But I think, when we do our events, like our live events or virtual events, it's just as, I think there's just as much value to people attending those, getting information from each other and just learning from each other's mistakes and war stories, as it is hearing it from a consultant. And I think in some ways, a lot of ways, actually, your peers are going to be a lot more credible, because you can relate to them better than you could a consultant who's an outsider, looking in. But if you're dealing with a peer who's sitting in your exact same seat and they've made some mistakes, maybe they've done some things right that you can learn from, that's pretty invaluable. And that tends to stick just as well, if not better sometimes, than consulting advice. So I totally agree with you on that.
The next one's a really big one for me, and I have a whole series on Diginomica. I've written about this. I think I might even have a piece about you in this series. I'll have to check. I'll check it out. But it's the importance of independent advisors in project results. And independent advisors can fit all kinds of different flavors. But what it comes down to is that whoever you select for your prime partner should have some level of accountability at various points. That could be independent subject matter experts who come in on a consulting basis. It could be people who participate in software evaluation. It could be people who do software audits and maturity checks. There's all kinds of flavors of independence. And it's very, very important to integrate their voices into what it is you do. And there are objections to this that I hear. And the biggest one is, oh, well, that's a political minefield and it makes things so much more complicated. And the main prime vendor is threatened by this, and it will, perhaps all of those things are true, but you still have to do it, because otherwise you're putting too much stock in one vested interest or two to make sure that this goes a certain way. And you can't afford that. These products are too important. So sorry, but you have to learn how to manage the politics of it.
Yeah. And I would almost argue, is it really politics, or is it that you have a party there that's calling out the elephant in the room, which is there's a problem or here's a risk and we need to deal with it, versus no, let's just shove that under the rug and not deal with it. So you could call that political, but in my view, it's like, yeah, it's sort of politics. It does get into some politics, but I think it's because it's somewhat of a threat sometimes to the SI. I know for us, a lot of times, I know a lot of system integrators don't want us involved, And it's not because we don't know what we're doing.
Exactly.
It's because we create a level of accountability and we expose risks, and that's what you should do anyway. Not because you want to point fingers or assign blame. It's not about that. It's just these projects are messy, and if you're not feeling like it's messy, you're doing it wrong. You're missing something if you don't get into the messiness of it. So you might as well just draw the messiness out, tackle it, deal with it, clean it up as you're going, rather than brushing it under the rug. And then post go live, you find that you can't function your business because you didn't deal with any of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I mean, in good, healthy product environments, it shouldn't be politics, because your partners should welcome that, and that should be part of when you select a partner. You should be very upfront with them that even though we're going to really put our trust in you for this project, we're going to have other people involved that are going to provide input in various points. And a good project environment, people welcome that kind of openness and appreciate like the informed judgment of experts, because the independents that come in are not coming in like to screw up your project. They're coming in to provide valuable perspective. And so ideally,
Right.
to your point, those politics shouldn't be there, but I just wanted to acknowledge it, because I do want to acknowledge that I do think it does require a little more finesse to manage, but I think the payoff is just so huge if you can figure out how to do it. So
Yeah. And the other thing too is, you were talking about, I can't remember if it's before or after we started the live stream. I know we were talking a little bit before we went live. But at one point here today, we were talking about how people need to sort of take control back from their project, and not necessarily just view it as an IT project. We're sort of talking about that whole technology versus business piece of it. And when you have an independent advisor, well, let me back up. When you have a software vendor, a big SI that's managing everything, and you have no other counter opinions in there, you're going to view everything, or they're going to view everything as sort of a technology first. Like if I'm an SAP integrator, let's figure out how SAP is going to fit in here. Well, there's a lot of places where SAP doesn't belong there. I mean, you can still be using SAP, but you don't need to be using it for everything. You don't need to buy every single module out there, or deploy it to the organization. So those are the types of decisions that happen throughout an implementation that, to your point, might be perceived as political, but it's, I think, just asking good questions and challenging, the status quo in a good way that's going to help you longer term.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just digging out the I can't remember if I think the piece I did on you is in here, but if it's not, I will correct that after the chat here. But I'll paste it into the Crowdcast. This is just a collection of those articles on independence. Then the next thing is I have two more. So this is the second to last. Is health checks, which is the other part of coming up for air. Is you need some form of health checks on your project on a much more regular basis. And so how that works is up to you. I'm finding that increasingly there's companies that will offer those to you and come in periodically to do some kind of a project health check. And, I'm not going to name a bunch of names now, because I don't want to do a big advertisement for companies, but they are out there. You can contact me offline, or perhaps Eric, if you want to learn more about that. But to me, that's, I know that it's kind of it's almost seems like a dental appointment. And so I know that companies who do these health checks do find some resistance from some companies, because sometimes it's just kind of like a dental appointment where it's oh, you might have a cavity over here. Well, that's not always the news you want to hear at that moment in time. But when you look back on it, you're man, I'm really glad I got on top of that. And so coming up for air more often includes a formalized health check that could take stock of various aspects of your project, whether it's project morale or timeline versus actual goals or whatever it is.
Right. That's a good one. And it, you coming up for air is an important concept. You want to be able to see the forest for the trees, and it's so easy to get down in the weeds and get all tangled up in all the details of how the system's going to get designed and built and tested and all that stuff. I think companies need to back up every so often and just sort of look at the lay of the land and see where the risks are, where the landmines are, and start to navigate those better.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially because there can be big leadership changes. You could have a CEO turnover, you could have an acquisition pending. There's all kinds of things that can change roadmaps and change goals. And if your business goals change, then your projects have to change. So all of that requires much more adaptable thing. And then the final thing, which could be a whole show unto itself, is my very firm belief that for the most part, go live is just the beginning of extracting benefits from projects. The idea originally came from my now past partner, Michael Doan, who I wrote a book with back in the day, but he had developed a lot of maturity models in the ERP and SAP environment to help companies think about how you thrive after go live, is how he put it. But the same is true for modern software. I've written some pieces on cloud ERP benefits and how I'm very struck by the fact that a lot of customers get so excited about their go live because they got off all these legacy systems and they integrated a bunch of databases. They rolled it out to new regions, all this stuff. The software is more user friendly than their old stuff. They think that's the end of it, but in fact, that's just the beginning. And there's so much more that is possible, but you have to work at it. And I could go into all kinds of things, whether it's automating workflows and creating the possibility to automate workflows, or whether it's dashboards and reporting and alerts infrastructures, whether it's new predictive technologies that gets layered on top of your core systems or whatever it is. But I've kind of outlined a whole framework for that because there's so much more that can happen after go live. And unfortunately, the reality is that if you just kind of do your thing, you won't achieve those benefits. They don't just suddenly magically happen. Yeah. It requires, in fact, in one of my articles on Cloud ERP, I'm just going to read this very short sentence to you. If I can find it. There we go. I say, in this case, I'm talking about cloud ERP, but it doesn't have to be ERP systems. Despite the benefits of moving to modern ERP, many cloud ERP gains don't seem to come until well after go live. Extracting full value from cloud ERP is not about flipping the go live switch. It requires organizational will and a fierce collaboration with the vendor and our consulting partner. And I go on to say, I don't care whether you call it digital transformation or business model evolution or agility or whatever the hell you want to call it. The point is you have to work for it. It's not going to land in your lap.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. And one thing that's always fascinated me about these sorts of projects and the way organizations think about these projects is you spend all this time and money, just massive amounts of time and money to implement and get to go live. But they don't spend that extra little time it takes to just fine tune it. And and it's not a lot of effort. I mean, in fact, I would argue the highest ROI you're going to get on any activity in your entire project is going to be those little things you do after go live. And it's just fascinating to me. It's like you went through all that heartache and pain and budget overruns and all that stuff, but you won't go that extra little mile to get some real value out of it. I mean, that's where and they're usually little things too. It's a lot of times it's like, we have a work group over here that's not trained in the system, or they just are using it wrong. And if we just got them to use it the right way, the way it's meant to be used, we could deliver X amount of value. So it's, identifying that laundry list of things that you could be doing, prioritizing based on value, and then going out and deploying just minor modifications to it. So I totally agree with you on that.
Yeah. So that's my list.
That is
if we have any audience questions or additions, I probably missed a few good ones, but that's what I prepared. So if anyone has any good ones that they like, feel free to throw them into the chat. I'd love to see, because at some point I'll write a new piece on this and I'll try to bring a lot of this discussion into it. So
yeah, I'd love to hear the audience too, in terms of what they might be, what people think you missed or what they would add to the list, or if you agree or disagree with anything, that'd be great to hear too. So let's see. There's a bunch of comments and questions coming in here from the audience. Here's one I'll cover here with you, Jon, see what you think. Isn't that a norm in big ERP projects to call on independent advisors during the realization phase?
If only it was. It should be.
Yeah.
Eric, you do a lot of this work. Do you find that to be the norm?
No, it's not the norm. I mean, obviously the clients that hire us, it's the norm. It's what they do. But what amazes me though is with, I'd say, an overwhelming majority of expert witness cases where there's a lawsuit and a project has failed and they bring us in as expert witnesses, or in cases where it's not a lawsuit, but it's a project failure or a struggling project and they hire us to come in and clean it up. In an overwhelming number of those cases, there was no independent voice of reason. And so the organizations get led astray down a path that doesn't necessarily make sense for them. And they don't know how to get off that path because they don't know any better. They don't know what questions to ask or how to redirect, or if they should redirect. And so yeah, I'd say no, it's not the norm, but I would agree it should be. And that's the whole reason I started the company that I started.
I guess I would say if you think that's the norm, you're probably working for a good organization, and you should probably
Yeah.
stay with that company. And congratulations for that.
That's
Any other questions?
Yeah. How about this? This is getting into a little bit of change management stuff here, but what are the musts in the communication plan during implementation? So what are the things we must communicate in our communication plan during a implementation or transformation?
I really like that one, because I do think companies, I'll be interested to hear your view on this, because I would definitely defer to you on change management. But my view is where companies can sometimes make a mistake is they can talk too much about how this is going to help the company. I do think that's important because we want the company to survive, but not enough about what the benefits are going to be for you. So what I'm looking for is more role-based information on how is this going to make the user, your daily life better. Because if it's going to help my company, but my job's going to suck for 3 months, that's not so great. And the other thing I'm really looking for is some real transparency around, okay, this is difficult. You're not going to necessarily enjoy all aspects of what's new. We tried to incorporate your changes, so in other words, the input's in there, but we weren't able to do all of them. We have to, in many cases in these bigger projects, we had to go back to standard functionality in certain ways, so you have to explain why you made those decisions. So I think that transparency around all of that stuff is really important to get buy-in. But the thing is, if you bring that communications plan in, you better have had input from those users long before that plan was ever written. Otherwise, I don't care what you say, it's not going to go over. You should have gotten their input from the beginning. A lot of times these line of business users will have better ideas than you do about how to use the software. So,
yeah, and I totally agree with that. And there's a lot of situations that we see where you've got a great change team in place. You've got very capable people that can handle the communication piece of it. And it's actually oftentimes it's not the communications itself that's the problem. It's that the organization doesn't take the time up front to define what the organization is going to look like and how the changes are going to be realized. So, for example, to your point about a job sucking for an individual, but allegedly it's going to be great for the organization. You think about, we're seeing this a lot with like AI and machine learning, and you build a business case that shows that, Jon Reed now is going to save, 60% of his job is going to be automated. So now he can spend more time doing other stuff. And so then you hand that off to the communication team and say, okay, there's the impact to Jon Reed's job. And what are you going to communicate? I mean, you're going to communicate that your job's getting automated, but you don't have anything good beyond that. Like, well, what are you going to do with that time that now gets automated? And now suddenly you're creating more fear, and you're actually perpetuating, you're creating resistance by communicating what's been, what you've been tasked to communicate. So a lot of times you see that the communication and change efforts actually backfire, not because they're not good at it, but because the vision hasn't been set for what Jon's job is going to look like and what he's going to do with that 60% of his time that now is supposedly going to be automated.
Oh man, I love that point you raised too, because there is still a lot of fear around automation and what that means for my job and my work. And, the good news is that we're seeing in a lot of cases that because of labor shortages and things like that, that when companies automate, they actually do need those existing personnel to perform hopefully even more engaging work, because it's not as repetitive. Like a lot of the work that gets automated is the more repetitive, mundane parts. And so hopefully it's the more interesting parts, whether it's customer facing stuff or more sophisticated shop floor stuff or whatever it is. But the one thing I would say is that headcount reductions do come along with some of these projects, and to pretend otherwise is totally disingenuous. And if you do have a headcount reduction, that does need to be communicated openly as part of this exercise, and to be able to say, look, we do have to, we don't want to, but this is the situation. But then on a personal level, everyone who's staying on, you say, look, we did have to let these people go, but you're staying. Your job is changing, but you're staying, and here's the opportunity, to your point, that you're going to have. And I think most people will embrace those opportunities, but you have to be fair about how you describe them, because otherwise they're not going to use your software. I mean, salespeople are the classic example, because salespeople, especially the good ones, getting them to enter the data that you want to put into the system, to make your AI better and to make your analytics better. Have fun with that. If they don't like using your system and it doesn't help them make more sales, they're not using your system. You can't force them to use. I don't care. You're not gonna be able to force them to use it. They'll just go somewhere else. They'll take another job. So I love looking at sales and change management, because that's a classic example of why, God, we need the data in those salespeople's heads. Well, how are you going to do that without losing your top salespeople? You're going to do it by showing them they're going to make even more money in the new setup. Otherwise, forget it.
Yeah, exactly. It can't just be an administrative task that they're doing for a greater good. You need to tie it to, you're going to actually make more money this way. That's a good, good point. Here's a great question from Frank Scavo. I think you know him, don't you?
Yeah, Frank. Yeah. Hey, Frank, how you doing?
It's good to see you too, Frank. Hi, Eric. Good to see you. Would you say that many companies are so worn out by the go live that they don't follow through to do that additional part to layer on the real value added capabilities? It's a loaded question. I'll leave it to you to take the first pass at that.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your answer to that too. Yeah, I think sometimes the go live push can be exhausting, but eventually people do recover from that. The problem is that they kind of lose focus on what's possible, and sometimes their partners move on to whatever's next as well and don't look at some of these higher level benefits, which are take a little more effort to achieve. Like in my thing, I talk about different stages of benefits. So I talk about things like the impact of data visibility in a single source of truth. I talk about setting up intelligent alert systems and anomaly detection. I talk about platform benefits and how to build on additional industry apps to your core, things like that. Researching future innovations provided by the vendor on a more regular basis, figuring out how to, all those things just require organizational energy and resources. But I think Frank's right that right after go live, you can have this big exhale. I'm not so sure that's a bad thing, but there has to be an awareness that now you got to come back to it. And this is, we talk about this notion of customer success, but it also applies to our own projects. Like, we got to keep working at it because our business model is never a done thing. We have to keep improving it, and the software is meant to help us with that, but we can't stop.
Yeah. And I also have to get to the root cause to Frank's question about why are people so worn out. I mean, I know these projects are tough. You and I have been through them. A lot of us on the call have been through them, but you think about, they're tough. Yes, they're tough to begin with. They're inherently tough, but I think a lot of times we make them a lot harder than they need to be, partly because we go in with these unrealistic expectations of, that 18-month global rollout of SAP, to 5,000 people. I mean, it's not going to happen in 18 months, but you're going to kill yourself trying to do it in 18 months. It's going to end up taking 24 or 36 or whatever. And you're going to be absolutely exhausted by the end, to Frank's point. But did you need to be? I mean, that's the question of, if you just planned for a 24 or 36 month rollout or whatever it is, and you just had that burn rate and that tempo set, and it's a more realistic tempo, then you're going to be tired. It's going to be hard, but you at least aren't so exhausted that you just move on. I think companies get to the point of like, hey, let's just cut our losses. Let's just stop the bleeding and stop this project. And they don't want to spend any more time on that value realization.
Yeah. Good point.
Yeah. It's a really good question too. I like that one. Alice, take one more question here, and then we'll be here toward the end of our time slot here. But this is a great one. I love this concept or this question, but do you think that user companies should build a sort of center of excellence for their post-ERP implementation life, or still be dependent on consultants to run their systems? Another great question.
I love the question. And I think I actually had centers of excellence on the list. So this audience member is definitely rocking it. The thing is, one of the reasons I didn't do it is because I started to feel like maybe it was a little more on the obvious side, and I wanted to do more underrated. There are a lot of companies that don't have centers of excellence. I do think that that it's an important aspect of ownership to think about how you cultivate internal skills. Now, look, you're not going to necessarily cultivate internal skills in every area of technology. So you won't necessarily have a center of excellence for everything. I'm generally a big fan of center of excellence for the areas that you're really taking ownership of, like whether it's ERP or CRM, or maybe it's BI is another really good one, I think, to have a center of excellence around. AI would be a good example of a problematic one. You have to really look hard at whether you're going to invest in a data science team and cultivate that team internally. Larger companies will, but what if you're based in a more obscure location where it's hard to get people to relocate, and that's important to you? Or what if you have a hard time holding on to these people? Maybe that's not the right COE for you, and maybe you're going to have more external support around those concepts. So you have to make those decisions. But the one thing I would caution around the COE is I think sometimes it can become a little bland. And like, even when you say it, it sounds kind of bland. And I think you got to start thinking about how a COE also isn't just a skill building exercise, but actively contributes to some business result. Hank Barnes at Gartner wrote a really interesting post a while back. It was short, like a lot of his posts are, so it left me hanging a little bit. But he talked about, what if we switch center of excellence to center of innovation? And I'm not a huge fan of the word innovation because it's so flogged, it almost lost meaning. But like, I like that shift a little bit, right? Like, how do we turn these into energizing activities that aren't just about filling skills gaps, but developing, new ideas that can really help the business? I think if you do that, then I think it can be a very powerful concept.
Yeah. And constantly looking for ways to improve and selectively leverage new technologies and, deploying those to your organization. And, tying it back to a comment you made earlier, again, this might've been before we went live today. But you were talking about low code ERP, and how the users are becoming more self-sustained or self-reliant,
Yep.
and less dependent on IT. With that movement toward, technology becoming more user-friendly and easier to manage it from the business side, I think that whole center of excellence concepts becomes a little more realistic. It's a little bit more doable now because you have technology that isn't so complicated that you have to have this robust, sophisticated IT support function. It can be more of a business user support function. So I think that's a great point.
Indeed. Absolutely. Good audience questions. People are on their game out there.
Yeah, some really good questions. Yeah, I feel like we could go for another hour. So I'm definitely going to have you back on the show. So cool. I appreciate you being here today. I really appreciate all the thought you put into your top keys.
Absolutely.
Top underrated keys to success. I love that concept. And I might have to borrow some of that for a blog or something.
Yeah, feel free. Cool. Awesome. Was a pleasure. Thanks for having me. Thanks for all the good questions, everyone. It was a fun time.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for all the audience questions. Thank you for being here, Jon. Diginomica.com. Check it out. It's a great article. Subscribe to the email, to that weekly email that goes out. That hits and misses is awesome because it's just a summary of all the stuff. So I encourage people to subscribe to that. And everyone have a great weekend, and we'll see you all soon. Thanks again, Jon.